Let me quickly ask you about the question of evidence of voter fraud, because this is one of the things you often hear. The opponents of the voter ID bill will often say, but you haven't proven the case. You wrote an op-ed in USA Today and May Everyone Elsewhere in March in which you said that you cited 50 instances over the last few years of voter fraud. Doesn't seem like very many to me. I looked then at this study that you know about the so-called News 21 study that the Carnegie Corporation and the Knight Foundation commissioned, in which they analyzed 2,068 cases of alleged election fraud since 2000. Of the 2,068 cases of alleged election fraud, a total of 10, not 10%, 10 were found to be voter impersonation, 0.5% of the total, versus almost 24% of the total, 491 of those cases, were absentee ballot fraud. There seems to be some acknowledgement that the real problem on voter fraud is not voter impersonation, but it's mail ballot fraud, and voter ID has nothing to do with mail ballot fraud. If you truly want to solve the problem of voter fraud, why not run to the place where it seems to happen most frequently as opposed to a small fraction of the cases?
Several key points.
Yeah.
First and most importantly, and that is to reemphasize what I said earlier, and that is in order to have a voter ID law upheld as constitutional, we don't have to prove any instances of voter fraud that could have been prevented by voter impersonation. That is the ruling by the United States Supreme Court. That, Evan, is the ruling by the federal pre-clearance court that ruled against us in voter ID. That court agreed we don't have to prove any instances of voter fraud that could have been prevented by a voter ID. So it's an interesting intellectual issue.
Well, do you dispute that the evidence is scant?
I'm going to answer it, but
yeah.
I want to make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
It is nothing more than an intellectual issue. It's not a legal issue. But intellectually, there are some other very important points. Point number one is, by you bringing this up about the voter fraud prosecutions I've waged, you act as though I'm the only authority in the state of Texas who either investigates or prosecutes the voter fraud. If you look at what a DA in South Texas did last week, he's hiring more investigators to crack down on voter fraud that's taken place in South Texas. If you look at what the United States Department of Justice has done, they've cracked down on voter fraud. All the DAs, all the county attorneys across the entire state of Texas, which means there's more than 200 of them, have the ability to crack down on voter fraud, and I have no idea how many cases they've been involved in that regard. Okay. And so voter fraud remains a serious problem, but let's look at this. Let me give you one example. Let's say that there's only been one example of voter fraud ever in the history of this country post-LBJ.
Well, that wasn't very sporting of you.
You can see how one example of voter fraud can change the future course of this country. And it comes in the two words of Al Franken. Remember this, Al Franken won the United States Senate by 312 votes. It's widely agreed upon right now that there were more than 1,000 fraudulent votes cast in that race. Those more than 1,000 fraudulent votes were cast by felons who didn't have the right to cast a vote. Now, I don't know for sure, but I have a hunch those felons did not vote for Al Franken's Republican opponent. If those fraudulent votes had not been...
Well, Norm Coleman was not as funny as Al Franken during that campaign. That's probably why.
If those fraudulent votes had not been cast and Al Franken had not been elected, there would have been one less vote in the Senate for Obamacare, and Obamacare would not exist today.
And if Clayton Williams had shaken Ann Richards' hand back in 1990, George Bush never would have been president. I mean, this seems like an unnecessary exercise.
No, people say voter fraud doesn't have any consequence. We know that voter fraud elected LBJ to the United States Senate. No. It's fair to conclude that voter fraud...
No, in air quotes. We know.
Yeah.
We don't actually know it. We know it.
I know, but it happens every day that people sign into the ballot box in alphabetical order, all in the same handwriting. But just enough number to win an election. We also know that Al Franken was the beneficiary of voter fraud, and we know that there's a real consequence that affects the daily lives of all Americans because of both of those.